Welcome to NAVO Listens, an interview series that features new releases in classical and contemporary music. My name is Véronique Mathieu, and my guest today is Dawn Wohn, a fantastic violinist who has performed around the world, and she currently teaches violin at the Midwinter School of Music at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. Welcome, and thank you so much for being with us today.
Thank you for having me. It's great to be able to talk to you about my album.
Thanks. Dawn, where did you grow up? And if you don't mind, how did you start playing the violin?
So I actually started playing the violin at a community music school because my sister was playing piano at the time, and I did not want to compete with her. So I wanted to learn a different instrument. And because I was pretty small and short, they thought violin might be a good choice for me. And I grew up mainly in the New York, New Jersey area. And I also lived in Korea during my middle school time. So I kind of have, growing up between two kind of very different cultures as well. But yeah, I think I ended up really taking violin more seriously towards my middle school and high school years when I studied at the pre-college division at Juilliard.
Great. Well, thank you. So we're here today to talk about your new release. It's a recording of works for violin and piano written by female composers. The title of your album is Perspectives. How did this project come about?
Yeah, so actually, when I was studying in conservatory, we very rarely performed works by female composers. So my knowledge um, of female contributions to music, whether it be composers or performers, were really quite limited. When I was doing my doctoral studies, I started to think about this a little bit more and realized that, what the schools had been teaching me was not the complete music history. Um, and then when I began teaching, I really saw that a lot of my students had had virtually no encounters with music written from different perspectives or different representations of different peoples. And I thought that the easiest way to encourage them to look into this topic would be for myself to play more music by different composers. And this particular album, I thought, would be a really good way to introduce them, as all the works were shorter works. So anybody could, you know, put one piece into their recital. And that was kind of the idea behind that. It was kind of an album for my students to get their feet wet, actually.
Hmm. Well, it must have been so interesting to research the history of all these women composers. You have such a great representation, some Indian, American, several American composers, Czech composer, French composer. Among all of these women, is there one story in particular that spoke to you?
I think a lot of the composers really spoke to me in that, um, I really wanted to present the composers as just really good composers, not just as females, but I also thought that it makes sense to make a whole album of female composers because nobody would blink twice if you were making a recording of works by just male composers. Um, I think out of all of them, Florence Price really um, did kind of lived with me a little bit more in that, some of her works, I mean, she was actually quite successful during her while
Hmm.
she was living. But then after she passed away, a lot of her works were forgotten. And then some of her violin works in particular were just completely unavailable until quite recently, that they were in some dilapidated house and being discovered in this way. It really made me think, what is it to be a musician if nobody remembers you after you are gone? And in that way, I wanted to make sure that, you know, now that there's digital recording available, there would be some footprint of these amazing works. And obviously she's getting a lot more playtime these days, which I'm thrilled about. But I kind of was identifying a little bit with that during COVID as well. Just, who are we as musicians if nobody's here to hear us play, or if we're not playing? I'm sure you
Yes,
identify with that
every
as
day.
well.
Well, let's take a moment and listen to your recording. We have a video of you performing Elfantance by Florence Price, which is also featured on your CD. So let's just listen to that. Wow, it is a beautiful work that hopefully will get to be performed by all of your students and more violinists. Thank you for sharing that with us. On the recording on your CD Perspectives, you are performing with pianist Esther Park. Can you tell us about your collaboration with Esther? Is this a long-term project that you two have had? Yes.
Well, Esther and I actually were assigned to play together when we were pre-college students. So, I mean, I don't know exactly how old we were, but I just remember we must have been preteens or something like that. And, awkward musician kids. The school assigned us to play. I think the first piece we had to play together was the Dumpi Trio. Um, and we, a lot of times violinists and pianists don't always socialize. So, the first time that we had met. And throughout the years, we've gone to, school together and continued a relationship that way. But our actual professional relationship really started to blossom after we both started teaching in higher ed. I think, transitioning from a performer and musician to a full-time university faculty can be a difficult transition. And we found emotional support in each other. And we also really were thinking about the lack of opportunities for students to have really great dual partners. During their undergraduate studies. So at that point, we started to kind of combine our studios and try to meet once a year to have our students play together. And during those times, we would also have our recital. So during those crazy times of coaching all day and trying to rehearse all day, I think somewhere in there, we started to think about doing a recording project. And we're actually just in the middle of starting to work on our second project, recording project right now. So it's quite a long-term relationship that we have.
Well, you're both really lucky to have such a deep connection and deep collaboration. That's great, and it really shows when we hear you two play together how the music just flows so well. And some of the works on this recording have never been recorded before, right? I think about half of your album has not been documented in the form of a recording in a CD. And one piece in particular was a commission, the composer Jung Sun Kang, which you commissioned. Could you talk about how you approached the composer, or how you went about choosing a composer for this work, or is this something that you had in the works even before the album was conceived?
So actually, when I first started to think about the album, I think it took quite a long time for me to kind of put all the ideas together. At the time, didn't know exactly what I wanted. But the one thing I did know for sure was that I did want a new work that had
Mm,
not existed before. Um, just as an artist to be able to have a work written for you is a very special experience. And I knew that I wanted it to be someone that may have had some shared experiences that I could identify with. Um, but interestingly, so I did want, an Asian American composer,
mm,
which Jung Sun is. I did not want somebody who particularly was writing in with a lot of Asian influences. So I looked for somebody who was an Asian American composer that doesn't necessarily have like a defined Asian perspective, um, because I did want it to be about the composer's voice and not particularly something that would fit into an agenda. Um, and we reached out to Changsun. We had known each other through mutual colleagues, and we asked her to write a piece. Um, we said not necessarily anything to do you know, with Asian music, but draws upon your background in some way.
mm.
And we kind of left it very purposefully vague. And she decided to write a piece that is just based off of a Korean folk story. So I think that worked out very well. The imagery is very vivid in my mind because I also grew up hearing this folk story. But it doesn't necessarily, I don't think anyone would hear it and necessarily pinpoint it to Korean culture. So I thought that was kind of best case scenario for what I had actually wanted, which we did not plan, but it ended up
Well,
coming out.
and we have actually an excerpt from this piece. Is the story of the tale something you can summarize quickly for us?
Sure. It's about two lovers, and essentially, to make it very short, they were separated and they could only meet once a year. They would have to meet across the Milky Way, and thousands of birds would make a bridge for them to meet together. And there's a day in um, not just in Korean culture, but I think in a lot of Asian cultures where it's in the middle of the summer and there's a lot of rain that starts. And they say it's because that's the day that they meet and they have to separate. So they're crying. And that's why there's a lot of rain on that particular day. So it's a beautiful story about love, but it's also terribly tragic because they are forever going to be separated and they get to meet once a year. So that's essentially the story. It kind of shows a little bit of the stars, I think, in the piece and like a longing for love.
Well, let's hear an excerpt from this piece by Jung Sun Kang, performed by you, yourself, and Esther Park at the piano. Well, so we just heard an excerpt from UCD Perspectives that features works by women composers. Why are these works so important to hear and to discover?
I guess for me, the reason why these pieces are important, along with so many pieces that um, As musicians, it's easy to feel like there is a certain way to play or a certain way to certain sound or a certain way to be. And growing up, there were moments where I felt like maybe this is not something that I can do because, maybe I'm not Austrian, maybe I'm not German. There were these thoughts that would come into my mind. Um, but little did I know, women have been making music and composing music and performing music for a long, long, long time. I think in some way, in my very little way, I'm trying to um, kind of make sure that history reflects the actual diverse people that exist and make music. Um, I think it's important for people to understand that music is a basic expression, um, that it is, I mean, people say music is the universal language, but then if you're only programming, European centric music, not that there's anything wrong with this music. I think it's very important and we must play it. But I don't want there to be kind of like a lens that we only see classical music in that way. I think it's dangerous to have that kind of false reflection and to also alienate a lot of people that could creatively contribute so much to music.
Mhm.
So that's kind of the thought behind my process. I'm so happy that a lot of organizations and people are more um, interested in inclusivity and diversity in their program. And it's so easy to do if you have to dig a little bit at this point, but there is so much music that just hasn't been performed. And it doesn't have to just be female composers, just there are a lot of works that deserve to be heard.
Absolutely. No, you explained it so well. Everything you say, I 100% agree. And I do feel the same way. And you have done such an amazing job finding all these composers and um, uniting them to get on the recording. It just, all the music flows so well together and the pieces are just all where they should be on your album. So thank you for producing this CD. It's a great, great addition to the repertoire and to what is available for resources for all of us violinists and teachers and students and audience, of course. Do you have any advice for someone who would be just buying your CD today and listening it for the first time?
I guess I may sound like an old person, but um, there is so much information available these days. And every time I say something like this, I feel like I'm dating myself a little bit, making myself sound old. But, the information that you are able to find these days, the recordings that are available, even performances that are not commercially released that are available online. There is so much information to be found. And I think as a musician, one of the greatest joys that you can have is to be curious, and that you continuously are looking for, um, to discover works, to discover different music and try new things. So I think this album was kind of my first way of showing like, hey, it's okay to try things, um, and to include different works that you might be interested in your program. Start with a few pieces that you really, really love and feel drawn to, and you can develop your area of interest, and that may change over the time. But I think it's important to always have some kind of area of interest that drives you, because sometimes that Paganini caprice is going to beat you down in the practice room, and to think of something that actually excites you to play, not just musically, but like in your soul and your mind, intellectually. I think that is a great thing to have, and I've definitely found that through these projects that I've been doing, and I think that would be something really great for somebody young to take on as well, regardless of what area that may be. And I almost wish I had started something like this earlier instead of, trying to think of what the pieces that I should have been playing, at the time, like what are the pieces that I think I need to play. And, I could have been programming something exciting and, hindsight is 2020, but yeah, that's something that I would encourage young people to do.
Well, and for anyone here in this city, most of these composers wrote other works for violin that are not featured. So there's still, if any of these composers seem appealing to listeners, then there are more of the same composers to discover for violin and for string. So that's also something to keep in mind. Dawn, thank you so much for your time. Thank you for talking with us today about your new album, Perspective, with Esther. And we will conclude by listening to an excerpt from Amy Beach's Romance. Thank
Thank
you.
you.